Greetings, students. I'll be your instructor for this section or this course of understanding the systems of privilege and oppression. And so this is our first unit. And so I thought it was important to start with understanding the history of privilege and oppression in this particular country. So the information that we'll be walking through here is going to be very helpful and important to you as in your careers as social workers, as you continue on this journey to learn about what we need to be doing differently in our society. So a couple of things I wanted to point out in our time together. So we're going to be exploring various systems of privilege and oppression that make up a part of everyday life here. And it's important for you to really have a clear understanding about how these systems operate in their origin if you're going to be effective as a social worker. We will be working oftentimes with clients in a number of different social service and settings and systems, and we need to have an understanding of intrinsically how these systems came to be if we're going to be effective as social workers. So I think it's an extremely important endeavor, and a part of your social work education is to really learn about these particular systems and how they play a role in the work that we do. So there's some expectations that I have, and when you're online as well as when we're in person, I would like for you to be fully present, to be able to respond with an open mind. Recognize that some of the subject matter that we will be tackling over this course will create some discomfort for many of you. I'd like you to also think about refraining from judging others' viewpoints or beliefs. I think that if we utilize the appreciative inquiry model, which really seeks to gain understanding about why people see the world the way they do, in the absence of judging that, then I think we all come out more educated in terms of how that process works. We also want you to be respectful to each other. We also want to challenge some mindsets, because many of you may have been raised or given information as you were growing up through educational systems, through family systems, about how things are in the world. And some of the stuff that you may hear and see will actually challenge that. So we would just ask you to open up your mind to say, well, what if this was actually accurate? And what if this was truly occurring? And more so, we really want to create a safe place for everybody to bring them full selves and their full truth. And so when we get together, if there are additional things, or if we recognize after some of these videos that there are other things that you need as a cohort to move things along in terms of expectations, then be mindful and let us know, and we'll make sure that we put those things into place. So I thought that I would start here. What I've learned in the number of years that I've been teaching is that the vast majority of students tend to be visual learners. So this gives us an opportunity, and I thought this would be a nice way to kind of segue us into this conversation, to actually have an illustration that really kind of illustrates what privilege and oppression actually looks like. So this is a tool that I discovered some years ago, and see that it has a lot of utility in terms of being able to help students understand these different systems that are here. So it's called the axis of privilege and oppression. And so as you can see, you've got a bold center line that cuts right through the middle. And then you can see on the top, you have systems of privilege, and on the bottom, you have the systems of oppression. And so if we think about how our world is structured by the various systems, if we look across the top and start in the privileged place, we see that being male and masculine, female and feminine, male, white, of European origin, heterosexual, able-bodied, credentialed, and highly literate, young, attractive, upper and middle class, an Anglophobe, having English as your first language, having a lighter complexion, and being a part of a religious majority like Christianity, as well as being able to be fertile and produce children. Those are all aspects of privilege that people either earn or have bestowed upon them just by virtue of being. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we start to dig into privilege in our particular work here in this course. On the bottom, you can see that we have the opposite. So the opposite of privilege would be oppression. And so for folks who are infertile and unable to produce children, If your religion is a minority religion, so it's not Christianity, if your complexion of your skin is dark, if English is a second language, if you are working class and poor, if you're unattractive, if you're old, non-literate, you have a disability, if you're lesbian, gay, transgender, if you're non-European, if you're a person of color, if you're a female, and if you are of what we refer to as gender deviant, and as you can see, the concentric circles connect to the other side of the line. So the opposite of gender deviant would be actually a male who identifies as masculine and a female who identifies as feminine. So being anything other than those two puts you in a category of being gender deviant, for example. So when you look at this particular system, all of us can plot ourselves in some form or fashion, either above the line or below the line. And this helps us to start to look at a micro level or an individual level, the privilege that we actually are able to have in our life. We're going to talk more about the systems that actually cause that to be shortly. So now we need to start out with some definitions as well. So we need to actually be able to talk about what privilege and oppression in these systems actually are. And so when we think about privilege, it's a special right or an advantage or an immunity granted or available to a particular person or group. So let me try and give you an example of what a privilege might look like. So I am a male, right? And so as a male, I enjoy certain advantages or special privileges just by virtue of the fact that I was born male. I have the ability to do some things in our society as it's currently structured that women are unable or cannot do or would have extreme difficulty in terms of being able to do. I was born male. I happen to identify as male. So I didn't do anything to earn this particular special set of privileges that I had to come along with being male. They just are, and I was born into it. So that's one way to look at privileges and one way to look at how we find ourselves in the situation. I also happened to go to college. And so I went to a four-year institution. I graduated with a degree. And as a result, I had then privilege granted to me to look at being able to be considered for certain types of employment that wouldn't be available for those who don't have a degree. So that's a form of earned privilege that I use to move myself socially up the ladder in terms of being able to compete. So those are some examples of what privilege will look like at an individual basis. But as we think about it in terms of a system, which we'll talk more about later, we can see how the impacts of that actually works. When we think about oppression, we're looking at restricted access to resources, marginalization, and isolation based on social group membership. So this is the opposite of privilege. It's like you can't have these things because you are not a part of this particular social group that has been deemed worthy of them. You're in a group that has not been. A clear example that we see all the time is when we have people who have been sentenced to prison. So you go to prison for a property crime. You steal a car, you do something dumb in your youth, or you do something as a young adult, and now you have a felony on your record. In many states, once you are out of prison, you no longer have the right to vote. So you are denied access to the political process. Even though you still work and pay taxes, you cannot vote for a certain period of time, or in some places, not ever. That's a form of oppression. And it's been justified by the fact that people have actually served time, and the reason that they may have been incarcerated may have nothing to do with their ability to vote. So again, it's just one example of what oppression might look like. Another example of what oppression might look like might be that if a person filled out a job application and had used a surname that was Hmong or Latino or African or African American, then I, as an employer, will look at those particular resumes, and just based on the names that I see, I will make assumptions about who it is that is actually applying for that job. And if I decide that we don't want that person to fit that mold, we want to look at a different individual, then I could clearly decide to not pass your particular resume on based on the name and based on my assumption about what the name means. So that's a form of discrimination. So that's a sort of systematic type of an oppression. So if I have an agency that makes their hiring decisions based this way, the only people who are in control are the HR people who make those decisions, and they can often go unchallenged. So again, when we think about systems of oppression, this would be one that would fit here as well. When we think about these other further systems of oppression, we think about these structures that perpetuate and limit our access to power, to legal systems, to education, to money, the whole 9 yards. So an example here might be, okay, I'd like to buy a house. So if I want to buy a house, then there are certain guidelines and certain criteria that has to be met for me to be able to qualify to buy a house. I have to have a certain amount of income. I have to have worked for a certain amount of years. I have to have a credit score that's within a certain range. I have to have any number of different things and be able to verify and prove those things are there. But if we go back to the situation where I was not employed because of what was assumed about the name that I used on my application, then it's going to lower my ability to have that income and then further perpetuate my inability to get qualify the housing that I need. That's a structural piece, and that's how these systems of oppression utilize legal, educational, and financial systems to actually perpetuate and further discrimination. So just to think about those things for a moment. I know you're probably wondering, like, why in the world are we talking about colonialism? And we're talking about colonialism because when we start to think about the history of how these particular systems of privilege and oppression came to be, we have to go back to the history of how our country started. So as you can see here, I've got some definitions that we're going to talk about here. And we talk about colonialism. And so we know, we all studied about the 13 colonies on the East Coast, and we came to America, the new land, and discovered all of these things that were actually here. The reality is that we colonized this particular country, and we took full as political control over this country, and the settlers who occupied here, i.e. our Native American brothers and sisters, and we exploited it economically. And we imposed our laws, and we did any number of things for the sake of capitalism and for the sake of colonialism. When we add that to the system of patriarchy, and so we know that patriarchy is systems of government as well as family systems that power is bestowed upon the eldest male, or the male is seen as the head of the family. So there are the ones who are able to make the decisions about what happens, and that patriarchy system continues to get perpetuated up in terms of our systems, macro as well as meso. And when we start to look at society, and we look at government, and we look at corporations, and various forms of political power as well as economic power, you'll see that women are, for the most part, largely excluded from that particular process. So that's a function of patriarchy, which is to keep male power concentrated in the hands of male, and typically white males. So if we think about how our society and community are structured, they're usually structured along patriarchal lines. And then we tie in this other dynamic about what happens here in our country is we have capitalism. So when we think about capitalism, we toot ourselves as being a capitalist country, and that's a great thing in so many respects. It's an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. That's an important distinction that we need to keep in mind, rather than by the state. Now, the icons here, or the trademarks that I've chosen, were just done arbitrarily. So there's no particular like or dislike for either of these organizations or any of these entities that are here, but they give these to show that there's an example of what the capitalist companies look like, the ones that we do trade with, and the ability for them to have incredible influence in all of the other structural areas of our country, be it education, be it finance, be it even family values. These are important players in that category. So when we put three together, when we add the effects of colonization, when we couple it to the enterprise of capitalism, and then we put it in place where it's run by men, it's a patriarchy, you have to have oppression in the middle to actually support the ongoing existence of this system. So something for you to really think about in terms of how we got to where we are, because this is really important. Here are an example of a few countries that have been colonized by Great Britain. Again, I don't pick on Great Britain in particular for any particular reasons because, as we know through the course of history, there have been a number of countries that have colonized other places in the world. And so we think about why that colonization is there, and we already have decided that it's for economic and political gain. So you might even notice that down in the right-hand corner, there's a very familiar flag, and that's our very own flag. And so we were once colonized by Great Britain as well. This particular slide talks about independence, for example. And so for when we think about the countries that were colonized by Great Britain, we see them, some of them here, and we see these dates next to them, and these are the dates that they were declared independent. So in other words, the rule of that particular country either partially or fully was given back to the actual natural inhabitants who were there. And you can see that the span of time is pretty interesting and dramatic. Actually, most people don't realize this, but the United States actually gained their independence in 1783 as opposed to 1776 when the Constitution was signed. So there is a piece of history piece for you there. And then you can see that there are some countries who were still under the rule of Great Britain as late as the 1980s. So this was times when I was actually in high school. And if you stop and think about what's happening in those countries now and what the legacy is there, many of them are dirt poor and have all matter of economic and political chaos because, you know, Great Britain pulled out and left very little structures in place, or there are parts of the world that still have the influence that actually comes from London, like Jamaica, which I learned during a recent trip there as well too. So just something to think about in terms of how we got to where we are. The next concept I want to talk about is a really important one, and that's the concept of ideology. It's about how people see themselves in the world and what their values and their beliefs and their attitudes are. Because our values, beliefs, and attitudes justify our treatment and our access of goods, services, and resources to others. So in some ways, it justifies inequality and it endorses and justifies the interests of the dominant group. So when we think about this whole notion of systems of privilege and oppression, and we think about race and ethnicity and social class and gender and sexual orientation and disability, and there are many, many others, we see that the quality of life for individuals, families, and communities are actually impacted, and it's due to ideology that's driven by institutional power. So when we got institutional power that's derived from either economics and or politics, then it sets up the rules and it sets up the parameters for what is acceptable in our society and what is not acceptable in our society. So we need to be very cognizant of that. As we think about these larger systems, because remember, we're social workers, we're journalists, we've been trained in micro, meso, and macro systems, and we know that systems are comprised of people. And people have different ideologies based on their own circumstances, based on what they were taught, based on how they were educated. And they then go on to develop these larger systems of education, healthcare, nutrition, safe housing, employment, and finance. So if we look at all of these particular logos here, and once again, in no particular reason or no arbitrary reason that they were chosen, but just examples of logos of large institutions that have a lot of influence in terms of what happens at the micro level, in terms of what we're able to have access to and what we're not able to have access to. So that's why those were included. So if we think about our current system, and we think about the ideology that drives a lot of the policy, a lot of the resource allocation or reallocation, then we have to come to grips with some of the ideology that perpetuates it. And so when we think about persons of color having less worth than non-persons of color, you basically essentially are talking about a system of racism which oppresses and denies ethnic groups based on their physical characteristics. Just what I look like will determine how people will respond and treat me. And that's a reality that people of color have to experience. Androcentrism, the notion that gender privilege, and I talked about it a little bit earlier in terms of male privilege that I have. It manifests itself in outright acts of sexism as well as gender privilege. In our society, men are looked at as being superior to females. Now, we know that that's not actually true, but all the rules, spoken or unspoken, seem to bear that out. And then females are seen as worth less and are often objectified. When we start to think about class, when we think about socioeconomic status, we also recognize that the corporations that we talked about are owned by a handful of people who tend to be the wealthy, who have access to institutional power, they have access to political power, financial power, and they actually are very instrumental in making a number of different rules and policies that actually govern how we live. And it adversely affects those who are middle class or working poor. The mantra has been and continues to be the poor are lazy and the wealthy are the hard workers in our society. As we move through with this ideology and we start to think about those who are in control of those major resources to make those decisions, then heterosexuals justify their privilege through moral and religious judgments. And they have their own ideas about what is appropriate or inappropriate sexual orientation and or behavior. And so they set up a system and a policy or rules and regulations that govern that kind of behavior. Who has access to certain things, who can be a part of certain functions in the military, who cannot be, who can marry who up until the Marriage Act was passed. We also see the same type of ideology when we think about able-bodied people who have privilege over those who are not able-bodied or those who have disability. And if you think about when's the last time you saw someone who had a clear disability actually in a position of power? In this particular country or running an organization or being a part of government. So when we think about that, not just happenstance or coincidental. When we think about Christianity, which this country was founded on Christianity, and how there's the notion that Christianity is superior to any other religion, to Jewish faiths, to various Muslim faiths, and it creates this oppression, and those who are in power happen to be of the Christian persuasion. So the ideology then continues to be perpetuated in terms of why we see things play out the way that we do. Other ideology that we see that manifests itself in some of the rules and regulations that we adhere to in most of the places that we go. People who speak English are more desired and more valued than people who have English as a second language. So, when you're on the phone and you're trying to get to a call center and you get a person on the phone with a thick accent, and people automatically make the assumption that they'll be harder to understand and any number of other things which could justify some treatment that may not be deserved. Youth is more desired than age. If you think about the tabloids that you see, if you think about the commercials that are being perpetuated and seen on TV, it's losing weight, it's using Botox, it's using makeup, it's using any number of things to look more youthful because youth sells and being aged does not. Credentialed and highly literate as opposed to non-credential and uncredentialed. So, if I have a college degree or a couple of college degrees, then I somehow am more important and have greater worth than someone who just has a GED or didn't finish high school. Attractive is being better than unattractive. You know that there are people who actually make more money based on their height and based on their look than those who don't have some of those same attributes. So when we think about that type of an ideology, it brings us to this new matrix of domination that is in place today. And so when we start to look at this diagram and you look at the top and you see economic control, and that's about people in the upper and wealthy classes, and it's about the goals of capitalism. As again, we talked about earlier, capitalism is about companies and corporations that are being run for profit by individuals who run them or boards. So they, in a lot of sense, have access to resources. They have access to resources. Think about the access to resources that like a General Motors may have. And then they also have an impact on socioeconomic status. When we look to our right and start to look at political control, These are where the laws and the policy and who gets taxed, why they get taxed, and who goes to jail and who does not go to jail, and the use of violence, as well as, you know, military organized violence, or as well as violence that just happens in our society. It's a political juncture. We go to war, and that's based on political policy, in terms of who is our enemy and who is not, and what reasons we engage in war. And then finally, on your far left-hand side, you have ideology. So you have the things that we talked about earlier in terms of how people see what they value, what their attitudes, what their beliefs are, what they've been accustomed to. And it's often housed in religion and what is family and family values. And then we have to look at who then owns the media. And so what gets reported, what gets seen and determined to be entertainment, and what is not. What's worthy news, what's unworthy news. Then we start to look at our very own educational system. You know, the college that you're attending right now, there are things that we are mandated to do and to teach based on ideological control. So when we look at this matrix of domination and we start to see who's left in the middle, look at the different attributes. So there's no hierarchy as it relates to oppression. Anti-Semitism, classism, ableism, racism, heterosexism, sexism in and of itself, religious oppression are just a handful of the results and the consequences of this matrix of domination. So when we have economic control, ideological control, and political control in the hands of a few, this is what the outcome is. So now we have talked a little bit about that history, and it's a brief history of this history of the systems of oppression and how they kind of came to be. So just to recap, we talked about privilege, special rights, and advantages and immunity given to people based on social group status. We talked about oppression, restriction, or access to these particular resources. We talked about systems of oppression, so larger structural institutions, financial, educational, social, that actually have a dictate and limit who has access to resources and who does not. We talked about the importance of colonization in terms of the process for how we come to be who we are. And we also talked about capitalism and the need to have a profit and to have control over these particular organizations that's delegated back again to the owners, not necessarily to the best interest of the state or our society. And then we have finally ideology. And so when we look at all of those particular things, we come to the realization that there are a number of different things that we need to be aware of as social workers, because oftentimes in a lot of those larger societal institutions that we just talked about and explored, there's not a lot of access and there's not a lot of control. So we'll spend some more time unpacking privilege and oppression and what that actually means. But this gives you just kind of a brief taste of what we're in for. In subsequent classes, we will dig deeper into those individual areas and have some more conversations to really help you get prepared. So thank you for your time and attention, and I will hope to see you soon.